Go ahead and get started. So my name is Lisa Ackermann, and I'm very happy to be able to provide you with an update today on a number of programs that MDF has been doing to accelerate the research for therapies. And also, I'd like to share with you a little bit about our plans for some future programs that we would like to initiate in the next few years. So many of you know that the mission of the MDF is to enhance the quality of life of people living with myotonic dystrophy, and also to advance research focused on treatment and a cure. So put simply, MDF has two missions that are separate but overlapping: care and a cure. Now, over the past couple years, MDF has put in place a very large, diverse, and wide amount of programs. I'm a biochemist, so that happens to me once in a while. A large number of programs that are towards our mission of a care and a cure. Now, many of you are probably way more familiar with the programs on the care side, and they include things like the toolkits, which is very popular, our monthly newsletter that is sent out with lots of different good information, and the care guidelines that you just heard about just a little bit ago. But what you might not be as familiar with is the programs that we have on the cure side, and we have a lot of them, and I'd like to talk to you about them today. So if you look on the other side of this slide you see up there, I have a number of buckets or categories. And these categories generally represent different kinds of programs that we have on the cure side. And all of the programs are aimed at lowering the barriers for drug development to find a cure for myotonic dystrophy. Now, before I talk about the specific programs, I thought it would be good to spend a little bit of time talking about those buckets or categories. Now, some of you who might be my age out there remember the Schoolhouse Rock cartoon called I'm Just a Bill. I loved that cartoon. And it was about a bill that was trying to become a law, and it was about everything that bill had to go through, going from committee to committee, standing in line, going back to committee, starting over again. And it was a really, really long time, but that bill finally became a law at the end of the cartoon. And I think they should remake that cartoon, and it should be I'm Just a Drug. And the reason I think that is because it's very similar to developing a drug. There's not a linear straight line. There's a lot of steps it has to go through. And often some go through very quickly, some take a really long time, and some never make it. So what I've represented up here on this slide are some of the buckets or categories that a drug has to go through to make it from when it starts from an idea in Charles Thurman's head, and then it gets translated into basic research, and then it becomes, at the end of that pipeline, a approved drug. So if you start at the beginning, basic research, that's when we're talking about scientists who are in a lab who are doing basic research to try to understand the basic biology of the disease. Now, if you're not a scientist, a lot of people like to step over this step and concentrate more at the end when we're talking about when you're getting close to approval of a drug. But really, this is the engine of innovation that provides constant supply of new ideas and new drugs into the pipeline. So it's an incredibly important piece. It's the foundation of every healthy drug development pipeline. And what MDF is doing to try to help that bucket, and one example of it is our MDF fellows. And hopefully yesterday, you guys were able to meet some of our fellows and look at some of the amazing posters that we had back there, really high quality science. And that's a very important program because we're helping to bring new, innovative, smart people into the field and hope that they stay in the field and continue to do research in myotonic dystrophy. The next bucket can be explained a couple different ways, but for this talk, what I mean by translation research is when you develop tools and techniques that help make it easier for a drug when it gets into clinical development. The next bucket is called clinical research and trials. And this is when you're doing the research on either healthy volunteers or patients. And it can be a drug trial in which you have a drug and you're trying to find out if it's safe and effective. And it also can be a natural history study. So there's no drug involved, but the researchers are trying to understand how the disease changes over time and how the disease affects the patients. This is a very, very important step in the drug development process. And one of the things MDF is doing for this bucket is we funded a 500-patient natural history study along with the MDA and the NIH to understand the natural history of myotonic dystrophy. So that many of the doctors that are here today are part of that natural history study. So if you have the opportunity to be involved in that, I highly encourage it. It's going to be incredibly important for the researchers and for the drug developers, the information that comes from that study. The next bucket is a regulatory bucket, and by that I'm just talking about the regulatory bodies that oversee the development process, and for that the FDA is one of the examples. And the final bucket is kind of a miscellaneous catch-all: payers, access, and advocacies. And that's talking about government agencies that are funding basic research for myotonic dystrophy. It's talking about the stakeholders who are going to be responsible for how much a drug costs, the reimbursement, and the access. So that's also a very important bucket that MDF likes to make sure we're paying attention to, and we have programs in that bucket. Now, like I said, the goal of all of our cure programs is to lower the barrier for drug development, to find new therapies to treat myotonic dystrophy. And so one way that we do that is we look at each one of these buckets that I've shown up there, and we ask, where is there a barrier? Where is it difficult for that drug to pass from research to translation to it being in the clinic? And then when we find a barrier, we try to fix it. And that could mean that we have a grant that we give to a researcher to develop something that's missing. It could mean that we go to the FDA and we talk to them and we educate them about the burden of disease and what it means to have myotonic dystrophy. It could mean a lot of different things, and so we're constantly looking at each one of those buckets, trying to find out where the barriers are and trying to do everything we can to lower them. And we do that for two reasons. One is that when there are drug companies out there and they have a new technology and they're looking how they're going to apply this new technology, if they look at myotonic dystrophy, we want them to look at it and go, oh, that's not so bad. I can do that. There's not a big problem for me to go into that disease. So that's one of the reasons. And the other is, right now there's a lot of drug companies already committed to doing research in myotonic dystrophy. But we want to make it easier for them to get to the end of the line. We want to, when they go through each one of those steps I talked about, we want to make it as easy as possible for them. And the reason we do this is we want to increase the number of companies that are developing drugs for myotonic dystrophy, and we want to increase the kinds of drugs that are being used in the number of companies. And what that does, it gives us more shots on the goal. That's better chances and shorter time that it's going to take for effective therapy to reach the patients. Now, in order to do this, and another sort of important aspect of what MDF does is they make bridges between some of the key stakeholders that are necessary in order to develop a drug. We have a scientific advisory committee that we rely upon heavily to advise us on research and clinical research and where the barriers are in that field. We work closely with industry partners, and they tell us, hey, this is a real issue. We don't have this tool available for us, and we try to help them with that. We partner with the patients. You guys are really important. There's many things that we do that require your input. We have a registry that's really important I'm going to talk about. We do questionnaires, the natural history study. So you're a very, very important piece of this collaboration. They're the regulatory bodies that are part of it, the researchers who are coming up with new ideas, and other patient advocacy groups that are also helping this disease. We're all working together because we all have the same final goal. So in 2015, MDF launched a very successful $5 million, 3-year campaign on the cure side. And that campaign initiated at least 15 different programs, again, aimed at lowering the barriers for the drug development. And I've already talked about some of the categories, and up here I've showed where the money went. So you can see for this particular campaign, we put a lot of money into basic research. It was almost about half of what the budget was. So back in 2015, when we looked at what was happening and we looked at where the issues and the holes were, that was a big piece. And we said, yeah, we need to put a lot of resources and strategy into that piece. But that doesn't mean it's going to be that sort of ratio going forward, because we're constantly looking at where the problems are, how the field is changing, and where it's best to put the money so that it's leveraged the most effectively with what the need is at the time. So here's a list of some of those programs that were initiated as part of that campaign. And actually yesterday in the research tract, we had a large number of the results from these programs reported out. There's a lot of very interesting and good data that has come out of this initiative, so it was really great to see how successful it was. But I'm not going to talk about all of those different programs. There's just one of them that I wanted to talk about today, which was the Myotonic Family Registry. So what is a patient registry and why do I care? So patient registries are really, really important, especially in rare diseases. One of the biggest challenges in a rare disease is that for a drug company, is that there's not very much information out there. There's not a lot in the literature, and many times no company has made a drug yet for that disease, so you can't go and look what other companies are doing and what they learned when they were developing drugs. So one of the ways that we get around this problem of not having that much information is by having these registries. And different registries will collect different types of things, but usually some of the things that they will collect is what kind of symptoms are you having, what your demographics, that means how old you are, where were you born, and they just lost me. Oh, okay. How old you are, where you were born, how is your disease progressing over time, and different things like that. And we collect all that information, and it's used in a lot of different ways. And one of the important ways that it's used is to educate researchers, educate the industry, and to educate the FDA what it means to have this disease, how it impacts the patient, and what is the burden of the disease. You can get that kind of information from many of these registries, so it plays a really important role for that. It also can be used to identify the right endpoints in a clinical trial, because you find out what's most important to the patient and what they want a drug to do for them. And it can help you even design clinical trials. So the registries are really important, and I really urge you guys, if you're not in the Myotonic Family Registry, that go to the website and search for it and register yourselves. But I'm going to give you some information about what we do have in our registry today. So it was started back in 2013, and as of July this year, we have about 1,700 patients that have registered in the registry. The biggest portion of the patients are the DM1s, that are about 1,200 patients, or 66%, and followed by that, we have about 300 DM2 patients who have registered. And then there's 300 patients who really weren't sure what their diagnosis were, and so they put other, and then wrote in a text field what they thought it was. So actually, when you pick that your diagnosis was DM1, you actually have 4 different categories that you can pick in the registry. The first is congenital DM1, juvenile DM1, adult onset with symptoms DM1, and adult DM1 without symptoms. And for DM2, it's kind of similar. You have DM2 with symptoms and DM2 without symptoms. So there's a lot of different ways you can analyze the data, but for the couple of slides I'm going to show you, what I did is I just took those buckets that are colored and just looked at those patients, because we were interested in seeing what the differences were in active disease with these different categories. So if you group everybody together, you can see that the average age was 44 years old, and the majority of the patients, 90%, were white. There was about an equal ratio of male to female, and most of the patients were from the US, but we have actually 60 other countries represented in the registry. And 45% say they were the first patient to be diagnosed with the disease, which means more than half of the patients in the registry already had a family member who had that diagnosis. So one of the things we collect are the symptoms, and these are symptoms that common to the disease, and as you can see, it covers the eye, cardiovascular system, skeletal muscle, CNS, respiratory system, and the GI tract. So we ask questions like, do you have difficulty breathing? But then we also ask questions about the use of devices, such as, do you use a ventilation device? And so this provides us with really good granularity information, because then you can analyze that data by each one of those categories. You can analyze it by age, analyze it by region, and there's a lot of really in-depth information that you can get from this. So in this particular analysis, what I did is I took all of those symptoms for the adult DM1, and I ordered them by what was the most common or the most frequent. So you can see all the way on the left side of the slide, for the DM1 patients, myotonia, fatigue, daytime sleepiness, pain were the most frequent of the symptoms that we asked about. Duh, you all knew that. And so that's good. And then over way on the right-hand side, the symptoms that not very many people said they had, if they were adult DM1, were emotional and behavioral issues, ADD, ADHD. So I took the data for the DM2 patients, and I graphed it right on top of the DM1. And the first thing you can see is they look pretty much like the same thing, which was really, for me, and I'm new to the field, but I was a little bit surprised by that their symptoms had about the same amount of frequency. There were some little differences like swallowing and whatnot, but it was not that big of a difference. And then when you take the adult DM1 and you put the congenital DM1 and juvenile DM1 graphs on top of that, you start seeing some differences here that you didn't see with the DM2s. So way on the left hand of the graph, the red means it's the congenital, and for them, they were saying the myotonia, fatigue, and daytime sleepiness was pretty common, but the most common thing for them was problems with walking. And if you look at the way to the right hand of the slide on those blue dots, which is the juvenile DM1, you can see how at 40% of those patients had a diagnosis of ADD or ADHD, whereas it was very low for the DM1 and DM2. So this is the kind of information that you can start getting from the registry. We also asked if patients used an orthopedic device or if they used physical therapy, and more than 50% of the patients in the registry said yes. And then we were saying, okay, well, what is it that you use? And that shows, I've shown the different categories and the percentages of the people who said that they used it. For example, for wheelchairs, 23% of the congenital DM1 used a wheelchair, and the DM2 was up at 17%. If you look at cane, that was pretty high for the adult DM1, 20% and 26%, but very low for the juvenile and for the congenital. Another thing we ask about is educational status, and here again, I'm going to compare the adult DM1 and DM2, and you can see they look very similar, and there's a high level of education, greater than 50% have a college or technical degree, and over 20% had a postgraduate degree. For the congenital and the juvenile DM1 patients, we were asking, do you use an individualized educational program or IEP at school? And a large percentage of them did. All right, so now I want to talk a little bit about what we're planning for the future. So we are looking ahead and again looking at our buckets and trying to decide, 2018 is very different than 2015, where it's best to place the money and where the greatest need is. And these are some of the ideas that we are come up with, and we're still working with our SAC members and others to refine this, but this is some of the ideas and programs that we're thinking about implementing. And a few of them, we've had generous donors already give us money that have enabled us to start a couple of these programs, and that would be the gene editing program and the mouse drug testing facility program. So both of those are well underway and are doing quite good. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the gene editing and then a little bit about the venture philanthropy program that we hope to start. So what is gene editing? Many of you have probably been hearing about it because it's been in the news a lot the last couple of years with CRISPR and other things. And basically, it's just a technique that can be used to very precisely cut out a piece of DNA, add a piece of DNA, or change the sequence of DNA. And this is kind of incredible because now technologies are beginning to evolve where maybe you can do that in a living person in a body. And there's still a lot of research that has to happen. It's a new technology, and still we're a long way from this technology becoming a drug. But it's exciting, and it's exciting too because it can be applied to myotonic dystrophy. You know, you could potentially dream of taking the repeat sequence and taking it out of the DNA. And so that there's a lot of hope that this technology will continue to evolve and someday get translated into a therapeutic efficacy drug. But there, as I said, there's still a lot of work to be done. But we receive a very generous donation to start pushing forward people to start working to applying this technology to myotonic dystrophy. And the first step that we did is we held a workshop earlier this year in which we invited 14 experts from the universities, NIH, FDA, to come in one place and educate us on what the latest technology and what the latest status of gene editing was. And also to talk about what are some of the challenges for applying this new technique for myotonic dystrophy. So it was a really successful workshop, and we had a lot of good input that came out of it. And one of the really important things that came out of it is that we ended up writing a grant, an award that we're going to award up to 2 grants of $250,000 each for an academic lab to do research using gene editing for myotonic dystrophy. So stay tuned. We'll keep you updated as that's going, but that's a really exciting initiative that's started. And lastly, I want to end with something that we hope to do sometime in the future, which is a venture philanthropy program. And the idea behind this is generally when people go back and they look at what it takes to become a drug, generally people say you have to start with about 10,000 compounds, and over about 10 years, maybe you'll get 1 compound that's in the clinic. And when you go and dissect what happens along the pathway as those compounds go to becoming a drug and ask, where are most of them falling out? Where are those good ideas, those promising therapeutics? Where is one place where we're losing a lot of them? And one of those places, it turns out, is in very early drug development. So you have somebody who has a great idea and is starting to develop a therapy, has a small startup, and what happens is they run out of money and it just dies, or they don't have access to the right information and the right resources to make it a go. And this has been coined the Valley of Death because they just peter out and that's where they die. And it doesn't mean the therapeutic wasn't going to be viable. It just means that's where they just ran out of resources. So what other patient organizations have done is they have created programs where they're funding these small startup companies that have promising therapeutics to help them over this valley of death, just to give them a little bit of extra funding, a little bit more access to resources to hopefully get them across one of the most critical junctions that they have. So that's something that we're looking forward to implementing in the future. So I just want to end with this couple thoughts. One is I think at MDF we are lucky in that we kind of have a bird's-eye view of what's going on in DM research and in clinical development, because many of the researchers and the companies come to us when they're looking to develop a drug and are asking for resources or need information. And as Molly would say, and a lot of people would say who've been in this space a really long time, that the number of people who are in this field doing research and the number of companies developing drugs has just been getting bigger and bigger and bigger every year. And right now, we're tracking probably about 25 different companies. Now, that doesn't mean 25 companies actually have developing drugs. It means some of those companies have just come to us and said, we have a technology and we think maybe it could work for DM. What's it like? How hard is it to develop a drug in the space? Some of them have very early drug discovery programs. Some of them are a little bit later. And some of those companies of the 25 aren't drug development companies, but they're what I'll call the the framework. They're the companies who make the tools that they sell to the drug companies. So they make a specific cell line that's for DM that they hope that the drug companies are going to buy from them. They are sort of like, they are the service companies. And more of those types of service companies are coming to us and saying, we're going to go ahead and make this product to sell to the drug companies that are doing myotonic dystrophy. And I think that's a really, really hopeful barometer. And the reason is they wouldn't be developing these tools if they didn't think that there was going to be a lot of need for them, because they have to put a lot of resources and money into making them. So pulling all of this together and watching the acceleration, there is a lot of hope that it's just getting more and more companies are coming into the space. And we're very hopeful that in a couple years, we're going to start building our pipeline and start seeing drugs coming in the clinic. So thank you.